If I could please invite you to take your seat. Before we begin our conversation with Yardena, we're going to have a short service to mark this moment. If you have a cell phone, now would be just the right time to be sure and silence it. It is hard to believe that we now have to have this date as a set date on the calendar. And yet I am deeply grateful that so many of us have chosen to be together and are remembering and marking this 2-year anniversary of a day that was as pivotal for the state of Israel and the Jewish people as days like Yom Kippur 1973, June 5th, 1967, or even May 15th, 1948. So often when we hold a memorial, it's for an event long in the past. But this event is one which we are still living through. For example, when we gather to memorialize September 11th, we're gathering to remember an event that happened, an event that's in the rear view mirror of our collective experiences. October 7th is not that. Sadly, 2 years later, we're still living in the pain of October 7th. 48 of our hostages are still in Gaza. I want to point out, people of Temple Bethel know and understand why we have pictures of these 2 young men of Galan Ziv on our pulpit. Our congregation has cultivated a very lovely relationship with Kibbutz Kfar Aza. And the kibbutz is still waiting for these 2 young men to be brought home. And so we keep their picture in our sanctuary as a reminder of the pain, not just of one family or one kibbutz, but the truth is, this is a pain that is pulsating through all of Israeli society and through the Jewish world. As we will learn tonight, October 7th in many ways is simply a continuation from an event that harkens back to 1929. The pain, anger, worry, and fear that we feel 2 years after that brutal attack of the Black Sabbath of Shmini Atzeret, or Simchat Torah 5784, is so very real. 3,000 years ago, the psalmist knew how we were feeling. In Psalm 120, the psalmist wrote, "In my distress I call to Adonai, God, answer me. Adonai, save me from lying lips and deceitful tongues." In Psalm 121, the psalmist wrote, "Esa enai el harim, me'ayin yavo ezri." I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where will my help come from? And he answers and says, "My help is from Adonai, who made heaven and earth." And in Psalm 130, the psalmist says, "Adonai, O God, hear my voice, be attentive to my pleas." I use the words of the Psalms to remind all of us, this is not the first time our people have experienced this kind of pain. And we have the stamina and the strength and the resolve and the resilience to get through this. But it's really hard. We turn to God for strength, for courage to carry on, and in this moment to continue praying for our hostages and praying for peace. This evening, we very much want and need to recognize the pain and suffering of our brothers and sisters in Israel. And to this end, I want to share with you a poem by Tal Shavit. Tal Shavit wrote this poem called "Good Day" in the days following her move to Switzerland from Israel in October 1923. From afar, she watched the way Israeli civic society mobilized by volunteering and contributing to the collective efforts in diverse initiatives, just like many in Israel around the world have felt since October 7th. The poem expresses the desperate need to be active and help, while at the same time battling feelings of exhaustion and anxiety. Tal Shavit wrote, I want to manage all the war rooms, mobilize all the supply chains. I want to take care of all the children, of all the single mothers, and those who are gone. I want to turn myself into protective vests for all the fighters, become iron domes over the heads of all the girls, each and every one. To sustain all families, the evacuated, the broken, the crushed, bring back all that is gone, return those who were taken. I want to collect all the donations and take them where they belong. To pass all the messages, to make all the sandwich, to oversee all the efforts. But on a good day, I manage sometimes to breathe, sometimes to drink something, sometimes to call loved ones. On a good day, I manage sometimes to cry. I'm going to invite Rabbi Mark Cohn to continue in our service.
Words that come to us from an earlier era, from the land of Israel. As the Second World War was underway, a young woman, Hannah Senesh, walked from her kibbutz to Caesarea and began to think these words. Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer leolam. Hayam rishru shel hamayim berak hashamayim tfilat adam hachol vehayam rishru shel hamayim berak hashamayim tfilat I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of man, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of man. And words even older than those of other times when our brothers and sisters, members of the house of Israel, were taken into captivity, standing somewhere between the sea, dry land, and a prayer that God would bring mercy upon them, bringing them out from trouble and sorrow, darkness and abandon into light and redemption and freedom. That is a prayer from many ages ago that sadly in every generation seems to be necessary, certainly in ours as well. Join if you wish in Achenu. Achenu kol beit Yisrael, Achenu kol beit Yisrael, hanetunim batzara, batzara uvashivya, haomdim ben bayam uben bayabasha. Achenu kol beit Yisrael, Achenu kol beit Yisrael, hanetunim betzara, batzara uvashivya, haomdim ben bayam uben bayabasha. Hamakom Yerachem, Yerachem Alehem, Beyotziem מצרה לרווחה, ומאפל על אורה, ומשיבוד לגולשתה, בגלה ובזמן קריב. And let us say, Amen. A prayer for the soldiers of Israel, that their work, that their strategies may be successful, that Israel's enemies may be subdued and fall, and that indeed that our soldiers and their commanders and all of the officers will have the wisdom and the capability to understand and to know who is the enemy and who are the innocent, and indeed work with wisdom and bring Israel to success and safety. מי שברך אבותינו, אברהם, יצחק ויעקב, שרה רבקה רחל ולאה, הוא יברך את חיילי צבא ההגנה לישראל ואנשי הביטחון העומדים על משמר ארצנו ביבשה, באוויר ובים. ייתן אדוני את אויבינו הקמים עלינו ניגפים לפניהם. הקדוש ברוך הוא ישמור ויציל את חיילינו מכל צרה וצוקה ומכל נגע ומחלה, וישלח ברכה והצלחה בכל מעשה ידיהם. ייתן אדוני לחיילינו חוכמה, בינה ודעת, שלא יספו צדיק מרשע, כמו שכתוב בתורתך, חללה לך מעשות כדבר הזה, להעמיד צדיק עם רשע, והיה כצדיק כרשע, חללה לך, השופט כל הארץ, לא יעשה משפט. ידבר שונאינו תחתיהם, ויעטרם בכתר ישועה ובעטרת ניצחון. ויקוים בהם הכתוב, כי אדוני אלוהיכם ההולך עמכם, להילחם לכם, עם אויביכם להושיע אתכם. ונאמר, and we say together, Amen.
We will continue our service chanting the El Malei Rachamim prayer, the traditional prayer of mourning, honoring the memory of the 1,200 individuals who were murdered on October 7th, the 913 soldiers who have been killed since this war began, and the 70 police officers who have been killed in the last 2 years. I ask that everybody please rise for El Malei. El Malei Rachamim Shochen Ba'amromim Hamse Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfe Hashchina Im Kidoshim Utehorim Kizohar Harakia Mashirim Lenishmot Yakirenu Shehalchu Le'olamam Ba'al harachamim yastirim beseter kenafav le'olamim V'yitzror b'yitzror hachayim et nishmatam Adonai hu nachalatam V'yanuchu b'shalom al mishkavam V'nomar Amen. Fully compassionate God on high, to our loved ones who have entered eternity, grant clear and certain rest with you in the lofty heights of the sacred and pure, whose brightness shines like the very glow of heaven. Source of mercy, forever enfold them in the embrace of your wings, secure their souls in eternity. Adonai, they are yours. They will rest in peace. Amen. We'll continue now with the mourners' Kaddish for all those who have died. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divra chirute v'yalmich malchute, b'chayechon uv'yomechon, uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uv'izman kari v'imru, Amen. Yehe shmei Rabbah mevarach le'alam ulalmeh almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitale v'yitalal shemei dekudasha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru, Amen. Yehe shlama Rabbah min Shemaya, v'chaim alenu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru, Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, alenu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru, Amen. We will conclude our memorial service with the singing of Hatikvah. Kol od balevav penima, nefesh Yehudi homia, ulfate mizrach kadima, ayin letzion Sophia, od lo avda tikvatenu, hatikva bat shnot alpayim, lihiotam chofshi be'artzenu, Eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim, lihiotam chofshi be'artzenu, Eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim. You may be seated.
I want to thank the sponsors for this evening's event, the Berman Snyder Fund, Patricia Ratner McWeeny, the Jewish Federation of Western Massachusetts, the Jewish Endowment Foundation, the Anapi Housing Fund for Israel, the JCC Temple Sinai, and Temple Bethel. We knew we needed to get together to do something on October 7th, and Patty Ratner McWeeny, who grew up in this congregation, heard Yardena speak and sent me a copy of the book and said, you need to hear her. And so I want to thank Patty for keeping Temple Bethel and this community in her heart. And I'm going to invite Patty to introduce Yardena. I just want to say that Patty grew up here. She's a retired lawyer living in Boxford, Massachusetts. She's active in her own Jewish community, and what I really appreciate is she can be active there and she can be active here, and she has room for all of us in her heart. So I want to thank you for that, and I'm going to invite you to come introduce Yardena.
Okay, so this isn't my bas mitzvah, right? Okay, just checking, because I'm not prepared for that. Anyway, I'm honored and delighted to be here to introduce Yardena. I met her last year when she came to the Marblehead JCC and spoke about her book. So I sent it to the rabbi, as she said, and here we are. So Yardena is your basic, nice Jewish, overachieving girl from New Jersey. She graduated with honors from Columbia School of Journalism and then headed off to work for an outfit called NBC News, maybe you've heard of it, in New York, headquartered, and she had stints on the Today Show, Nightly News with Brian Williams, and Andrea Mitchell. In 2013, she earned an Emmy nomination for her work at MSNBC, and then received the 2016 RNA Award for Excellence in Magazine Reporting. She moved to Israel in 2013 and lived there until 2023. And throughout that time, she reported for various publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, The Economist, and others. She has also reported not just from Israel and the United States, but from Morocco, Nepal, Ukraine, Poland, Germany. The girl gets around. She now lives in Hudson Valley with her adorable husband, whom I also met last year, and her 2 children, whom I assume are also adorable. This is her first book. I will close with this. So, you can't tell from the title of the book, Ghosts of a Holy War, but there's a love story component to the book. And last year, when we had dinner together before going to the JCC for the event, the woman at the table next to us, who I was convinced was going to the event because she seemed very interested in our conversation. And then at one point, she just said, Yardena, which surprised all of us. And then she said, I'm Sylvia's daughter. And that's all I'm saying now. You'll have to read the book to find out why that surprise meeting had such tremendous emotional impact on those 2 women. And I hope you do that. Welcome to Temple Beth El, Yardena.
So the way we decided to do this is kind of a question and answer conversation. We have, on the one hand, we have questions, and on the other hand, we're going to be listening and paying close attention because we'll probably have a question that we didn't think about. But to begin with, and really, Patty, you're really like people have to read the book after the story Patty just told. But for those in the audience who haven't read Ghosts of a Holy War yet, because I know you're all going to want to, can you start by giving a brief synopsis of the book?
So first of all, thank you for bringing me here, rabbis. Thank you.
Wait, did you turn it on?
No? Can you hear me now? Is that good? Okay. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thank you, rabbis, for bringing me here. And thank you, Patty, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you for not giving away the rest of that story.
They want you to sit there so it's more in the center.
Okay, thank you. Good idea.
And rest it even closer on your chin.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
So the book, Ghosts of a Holy War, the subtitle is the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. So it tells the story of this massacre, but not only the massacre itself, but also the causes and the aftermath of this massacre in Hebron, in what was then British Mandate Palestine, which essentially is ground zero of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the ground zero you've never heard of, for good reason, because it really challenges so much of the conventional wisdom about this conflict and what it's truly about. And so the book takes us from a bit before 1929 through the story of a young American named David Schoenberg, who sailed from Memphis, Tennessee, ended up in what was then the most prestigious yeshiva in the land of Israel at the time, in Hebron, in 1929, and takes us from 1929 through today, post October 7th. And I started writing this book back in 2019 to tell the story of this very little known massacre that explains so much of the conflict. And I was still writing the book on October 7th, and it became much more relevant than I ever hoped it would be.
So how did you then come to write this story?
So the young man I mentioned, David Shainberg, he was 22 when he left his home in Memphis to study at the Hebron Yeshiva. And over the course of his year of living there, he wrote these long, beautiful, poetic letters to his family every week. Each letter was about 10 pages long. And his family in Memphis saved those letters. And in 2009, a 70-year-old Jewish grandmother was moving out of her home and found this box of letters in her attic. And they were David's letters from the late 1920s, written from Hebron, sent to Memphis. They were saved by his parents, but Susie, Susie Lazaroff, the woman who found these letters, she had known that she had an uncle, David Shainberg, who was killed in the 1929 Hebron massacre, but she and the rest of her family knew very little about David, why he went to Hebron, what happened there, why this massacre took place, and what the aftershocks of that massacre were. And over the course of the next 10 years, her daughter Jill spent hundreds of hours trying to piece together these letters and the story of her late uncle, and realized after 10 years and putting these letters in an archive room in Memphis that her family was sitting on a treasure trove of history, and that they needed to get these letters to someone who could bring this story to the world. And so naturally, they did not think of me. They thought of Yossi Klein Halevi, a well-established author who has many masterpieces under his belt. They wanted him to tell this story. He fell in love with the story right away, was captivated by David's letters and his story, but he couldn't take on the project because he was already committed to writing his next 3 books. But he promised the family that he would find them the right person, and I'm flattered to say I was the first person he asked if I was interested in telling this family story, and of course I said, yes, but how do you write a book? Because I had been a journalist for years, but I had never written a book. I had always dreamt of writing a book, and thankfully, not only did Yossi essentially hand me this book on a silver platter through the connection to this family, but also was my mentor throughout the process. So I really cannot imagine a better mentor for writing a book about Israel than Yossi Klein Halevi.
I'm sure. So what was it like to read David Shainberg's letters? Like, first of all, did he have a nice handwriting? Like, what was that? That must have been something. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It felt almost like a sacred act, reading his letters and transcribing them. They were all in cursive. Thankfully, I went to school when cursive was still being taught, so I was able to decipher them. And it was just really shocking to learn about what Hebron was back in 1928 and 1929, because, I think of myself as somebody who's pretty, well-read on the subject of Israel and its history. I, studied the Arab-Israeli conflict in undergrad, and then after going to journalism school, I was based in Israel for 10 years, read so many books about this conflict, and yet had never known that Hebron, before this massacre, which I also knew very little about, was this place where Jews and Muslims lived side by side in relative peace and harmony for centuries. Jews were, albeit, an inferior minority living among, an Arab majority in the city of Hebron, but they owned businesses together, they attended each other's weddings and holidays and celebrations, they drank coffee together in one another's homes, played backgammon together. It was just the kind of relations that you could never imagine happening today in Hebron. If you've been to Hebron, you'll know what I mean. If you haven't, it's a place where Jews and Arabs, or Israelis and Palestinians, do live side by side, which is the only, this is the only place in the West Bank where Israelis and Palestinians live in the same town, but it's not coexistence. You would never use that word to describe the situation in Hebron, and it's just, it's very volatile, very violent, and the Hebron that David described in his letters was just this beautiful, peaceful, serene place that was untouched by time, and it really just, he describes it as really appearing as if it was still biblical Hebron, where Abraham and Sarah and the rest of the patriarchs and matriarchs were living and where they are buried. And just, I learned so much about Hebron through reading David's letters. And it was also really interesting to read them as a young woman who, like David, left the comforts of, American Jewry behind to start a new life in a very strange place. I think it was a lot stranger back in 1928 when David moved there. But I found it really powerful to be not just reading his words, but trying to bring him back to life through this book. And I'm so grateful to David for making my job so easy, because he was so descriptive in the way he described not only his experience as a yeshiva student in Hebron, but also just as an American Jew traveling around what was then British Mandate Palestine, and he would visit citrus groves and various places that we hear about in terms of the origin stories of Israel, but he was really living it. And so it was just really beautiful to be able to bring that to life.
So at dinner, you were sharing that when you were in journalism school at Columbia, you took a religion and journalism class, right? And you went once to Hebron with that class, and then that's the thing. Like, you go to Israel, you live in Israel. I lived there a year. I would never have imagined going to Hebron. Just because of the danger of the place, and I'm wondering, you had gone there once with the journalism school. What was that experience like? And then you read David's letters. Like, what's the juxtaposition for you in that imagery?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it is really astounding to imagine. I went to Columbia Journalism School in 2011. The journalism program, the Graduate School of Journalism program, is 1 year. So it was from 2011 to 2012, and our covering religion class went to Israel. And at the time, going to Israel at Columbia was not controversial. We were a class of about 24 kids. I was the only Jewish student in my class. There were at least 3 Muslim students. One of them was Palestinian. No one objected to this trip to Israel, not in the class, not outside of the class. There was nothing controversial about it. Fast forward to today, you can only imagine what would happen if a journalism professor at Columbia tried to take his students to Israel to report there. But yeah, our trip was about 2 weeks, but one of the days was in Hebron. And it was actually a tour run by Breaking the Silence. If you know of that organization, it was established by former Israeli soldiers who had served in Hebron and other parts of the West Bank and wanted Israelis to know what was happening in these areas. And so they took us to areas of Hebron where Palestinian residents aren't allowed to walk on their own streets, aren't allowed to drive their cars on their own streets. They took us to the grave of Baruch Goldstein, who carried out his own massacre in 1994 of Muslim worshippers inside the Cave of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs. And so the experience I had in Hebron in 2011 was a very specific kind of experience. And I, after reading David's letters, was really shocked when I realized that they never mentioned the massacre in 1929. They didn't mention that Hebron had had a Jewish presence. They spoke about the Jewish settlement in Hebron, and we always hear about, the Jewish settlers in Hebron, the Jewish settlements in Hebron. They never mentioned to us the fact that Jews had lived in Hebron for thousands of years. There was a Jewish quarter of Hebron that was destroyed in 1929. They didn't mention the fact that the reason why there are certain abandoned buildings in Hebron is because those buildings were owned by Jews, and essentially are still owned by Jews, but then when the massacre occurred in 1929, those homes were taken over by Arab residents. When Jordan captured Hebron during 1948 and occupied the West Bank from 1948 to 1967. They declared it all Zionist enemy assets, and nobody was allowed to live there. And, they just didn't mention so much of the history of Hebron that I came to learn after reading David's letters. And so that was one of the reasons why his letters were so interesting to me, because this notion I had of Hebron before reading those letters, by the way, that trip in 2011 led me to avoid going to Hebron ever again. I was so disturbed by what I experienced there that once I moved to Israel in 2013 and made Aliyah, I never went to Hebron. That was the only time I had been to Hebron, never planned on going back until I read David's letters and saw that there was a side of Hebron and its history that had been not only hidden from me, but was being hidden from so many people. And that was one of the reasons I was so interested in writing this book.
So when I first started to read your book, I was really taken by it because I did the Breaking the Silence trip in about 2015 or 16. And I also had this vision of Hebron, which came for this particular angle. I have to say the part of what made the trip particularly hard is even back then, there were cantorial students from one of the local seminaries who even then were anti-Zionist. So I just want to say that was like, back then already, it was like percolating and starting. But one of the things about reading your book and why I want everyone to read it is your description of the massacre is so painful. But the thing that gives me comfort now is that there is an Israel Defense Forces, there is an IDF to support Israel. And one of the things you really highlight really beautifully is the British turns their back, right? The British really was like, in many ways, this happened because they weren't doing their job. And you did a marvelous job showing that. And so I just want to actually thank you and say you brought to light, if anybody's paying attention, you brought to light how vulnerable Jews are when they can't protect themselves. And so I want to thank you for that. But more than that, I want you to talk a little bit more about what you learned about the massacre that you didn't know before, because, like, as I said, one piece I took, but that I imposed that on your writing, but I wonder what else you learned about the massacre that you didn't know beforehand.
Yeah, so one thing, I guess the most prominent aspect of the massacre that I was unaware of, and I think it's so informative for us today, was the fact that it was fueled by disinformation. We often think about disinformation and misinformation as a plague of the modern era, a plague of social media and modern times, but disinformation was rampant in 1929, and I'm sure it was rampant long before that. And the reason this disinformation campaign back in 1929 was so successful was that it revolved around lies pertaining to Islam and Al-Aqsa Mosque. If you're not aware of what Al-Aqsa Mosque is, it's the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. It's the mosque that was built atop the ruins of the ancient Jewish temples in Jerusalem, the site we know as the Temple Mount. In Arabic, it's known as Al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa compound. So in 1928, the leader of Palestinian Muslims living under British rule, the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, whose name you might have heard before because he also later aligned himself and his cause with the Nazis, and actually lived in Berlin in a Nazi-financed state. We can get to that later. But when he was still just the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, he began this rumor in 1928 that the Jews of Palestine were planning to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque in order to rebuild their ancient temple. This is, by the way, the first time this rumor was born. And if it sounds familiar, it's because October 7th was named the Al-Aqsa Flood. Also might sound familiar from the Second Intifada, which is known in Arabic as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. So this lie about this supposed Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa began back then in 1928 and led to the riots of 1929. And the epicenter of those riots in 1929 was Hebron, which was, again, this haven of coexistence. It was considered the safest place to be a Jew in Palestine. This was why the Hebron Yeshiva established itself there in 1925, because it was actually established by Lithuanian Jews who were fleeing Lithuania looking for a new home for their synagogue, sorry, not their synagogue, their yeshiva in the land of Israel. And they considered various places throughout the land, including Rehovot, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and they chose Hebron because it was such a safe place for the Jewish community, and because it was this beautiful, serene, peaceful place. Really just the perfect place to have a yeshiva where you could be kind of just immersed in learning. And that sense of safety was shattered by the massacre. And another surprising element that came through my research was the fact that in the days before the riots erupted, the Jewish leaders of Hebron were warned repeatedly, not just by their Arab neighbors and friends, but also by the Haganah. The Haganah, the predecessor to the IDF, the Underground Jewish Defense Force. They had members come to Hebron several times to warn the Jewish leaders there that there was going to be a massacre in Hebron. They believed that it was going to begin in Jerusalem, which it actually did on August 23rd, 1929, and that it would then spread to all corners of Palestine. And the Jewish leaders of Hebron were unanimous in their opposition to the Haganah, insisting that they either evacuate them out of Hebron until the riots subsided, or that they have armed men and women from the Haganah protect them in Hebron. And the Jewish leaders of Hebron said no to either of those options. They said we're going to stay here. Our Arab neighbors are our friends, they'll never hurt us. And they were confident of that, not only because of their relationships with them, but also because in previous rounds of violence, which were not as deadly as the violence that tore through Palestine in 1929, but in previous eruptions of violence in 1920, 1921, when there had been deadly riots in Jerusalem and Jaffa, those riots never reached Hebron. So those leaders of the Jewish community in Hebron were so wrong that the experience of 1929, when not only their Arab neighbors turned on them, but when the British, who ruled Palestine and under the British mandate were required to protect the Jewish community of Palestine. I mean, the British mandate was essentially the Balfour Declaration. It enshrined the British promise to ensure that the Jewish people would have a home in the ancient Jewish homeland. It also ensured that the Arab community's rights would also be protected. You know, a lot of people try to twist history and claim that the British mandate or the Balfour Declaration said that only Jews could live in Palestine. That was not the case. It promised that there would be equal rights for all. But one of the reasons why the Grand Mufti and other Arab leaders started this disinformation campaign and this propaganda campaign was because they were so threatened by the idea of Zionism, by the promise of a Jewish home in Palestine, not because it was going to threaten Arab rights, but because it was going to threaten the domination that had characterized life for Arabs in Palestine and the inferiority that characterized Jewish life in Palestine. Because before the British took over Palestine from the Ottoman Empire, Muslims were the dominant, they were first-class citizens, and Jews and any non-Muslims were second-class citizens. And so this propaganda campaign was a way for them to convince the Arabs of Palestine that the Jews were actually a threat to their livelihood, to their religion, and sadly it was extremely successful in the same way we see so many propaganda campaigns being so successful today.
Just could I sneak in one question? So what do you think motivated the Mufti's deep disdain? Was he the founder of fundamentalist Islam before we would put those two words together? Or what motivated him? I really want us to dig in on that for a second, because I feel like in many ways that chapter is profoundly connected to this moment in Jewish history.
So it's interesting because I think that more than anything, he saw the hatred of Jews as a tool for his own power. He saw how galvanizing his propaganda campaign was and how successful it was at distracting his people from his own corruption. For years, the Mufti had faced accusations that were correct, accusations of corruption, nepotism, misuse of religious funds. And once he established for his people that the Jews of Palestine were going to destroy their holiest site, almost all of that criticism just melted away. And suddenly, all of his political rivals, the Arabic press, all of these people that had been criticizing him suddenly had a much more dangerous threat to focus on. So that was one thing. Also, he had a very, he had learned under various Islamic teachers in Cairo that had started to kind of bring back this talk of a caliphate, and they taught about how the Jews in Mecca and Medina had, ignored the prophet's claims and went against the prophet's claims and refused to follow. I mean, it's very similar to a lot of the early Christian anti-Semitism, but it's kind of just the Islamic version of that, claiming that Jews were an abomination to Islam because they were trying to have sovereignty in this holy land, which was to them holy Muslim land and must always be a holy Muslim land. So that was one of the driving forces of the Mufti's opposition to Zionism as well, because he saw this Jewish presence as a contamination of this holy land.
And I also thought it was interesting in continuing about the Mufti, the talk, it's not anti-Semitism, it's anti-Zionism, but you point out when he's being interviewed by the British after the massacre, he's liberally quoting from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and then works for Hitler for 4 years, recruiting Muslims for the Nazis. Paid, as you point out in the book, paid more than the German generals. And then who is Yasser Arafat's mentor? The Grand Mufti.
And his cousin.
Right. And Yasser Arafat's his cousin. So we see also this through line of classic historical anti-Semitism, and here you have in Hebron this yeshiva. They're trying to escape the anti-Semitism of Lithuania, and it just followed them. And so what's interesting, right? People made Aliyah to Israel to escape that anti-Semitism of Europe, and now they're facing it in mandatory Palestine. How do the leaders of the Yishuv, how do they respond to the massacre? What does that lead the Israelis, Israelis? How does that lead the Jewish community to respond?
So I should say that before 1929, Zionism was not a rallying force within the Jewish community of Palestine, nor was it a rallying force outside of the land of Israel and the diaspora. Within Palestine, it was actually very controversial. It was seen by traditional Jews and Sephardi Jews, Mizrahim, as this secular European movement that was anti-Jewish. It was something that David described as a vile anti-Jewish movement in one of his letters to his father, which really just blew my mind, because I'm thinking, wait, but you're moving to Israel, aren't you a Zionist? But this is how we see it now. But then it was very different. There were many within the traditional Jewish community in Palestine and in the diaspora, in the land of Israel and in the diaspora, who believed that the return of the Jewish masses to Zion should only be achieved through the will of God and the arrival of the Mashiach, of the Messiah. And this movement that was saying, no, we need to do this now, we need a refuge, we need to return to our homeland, to them was trying to take the work of God into the hands of man. And so that was, there were other through lines here, but that was sort of the main reason why there was such controversy around Zionism within Palestine. But after the massacre, when the people who paid the heaviest price were not Zionists. They were pious Jews living a quiet existence centered around the Torah. The community in Hebron was so anti-Zionist that they rejected having a memorial service when Herzl died. There were efforts to have a service there in 1904, and the community was adamant that they wanted nothing to do with it. And the massacre and the British absolute failure not only to protect the Jews from these riots, but also to do anything in advance to prevent what was very obviously going to be a massacre of the Jewish community. They had proven to the Jewish community that they needed Zionism. So these people who had been opposed to Zionism before now understood, if we want to live in our homeland, we're going to need our own country and our own army to protect us, because no foreign power is ever going to protect us. And they learned that in the most horrific of ways in 1929, not only in Hebron, but elsewhere, where British police chiefs, British officials literally either looked the other way or didn't look the other way, stood there as Jews were slaughtered before their eyes. And in Hebron, the only reason the riots ended was because the rioters turned their swords in the direction of the British police chief and said, let's get him. And then he finally fired his gun for the first time that day, and the rioters dispersed immediately. And I should mention, I say Schwartz because this was a true massacre. No one was killed with a gun. They were slaughtered, butchered with swords, axes, daggers. One of the reasons why the parallels between 1929 and October 7th were so haunting, or because what happened on October 7th when Jews were hunted down and children butchered in front of their parents and women and teenage girls raped, this happened in 1929 on a much smaller scale because it was a much smaller population, but the impact was absolutely transformative. So, the Zionist community in Palestine before 1929 suddenly now included the Sephardim, the traditional Jews. It really transformed Zionism, and it also strengthened the Haganah, because the Haganah before 1929 was this very loose band of very poorly armed fighters, and after 1929, when the Yishuv realized they needed to protect themselves, it became more centralized, better trained. So many more fighters joined the Haganah.
So it's really interesting, because this is where the parallel breaks down in a really painful way, which is, it is astounding to me how many, they may be well educated, but they don't understand the situation. How many American Jews do not recognize the importance of the IDF, and they focus on, listen, the IDF is an army like any other army, so they do bad things. I mean, they're soldiers, they're not perfect, and bad things happen. But it is astounding to me how many American Jews don't understand that if Israel didn't have an IDF, October 7th would have gone on to October 8th and 9th and 10th and 11th. And so there I think, wow, in 100 years we've learned absolutely nothing. And we're like, that's a painful point today, that back in 1929 they figured it out better, actually. And that was one of the things. I just wanted to ask you, in the book you make the case that this conflict played out over the last 100 years and was not a foregone conclusion, that there were moments that the story could have made a left turn or a right turn. So I wonder if you can tell us about some of those inflection points and where you see the arc of the conflict and our reality today, and help us understand how we got here and where we could have made different turns along the way.
I mean, I think there are so many different points where things could have gone differently and gone better. I mean, one of the more recent ones, at least if you're thinking about the last 100 years, was in 2000, when Israel offered to hand over 98% of the West Bank, all of Gaza, East Jerusalem. We could have had a two-state solution since 2000. Instead, we got the Al-Aqsa Intifada and 5 years of suicide bombings. 1947, when the UN voted to partition Palestine into 2 states instead of declaring jihad and starting the war of 1948, back in 1947, when it was actually just a civil war between the Arabs of Palestine and the Jews of Palestine, had the Grand Mufti and all the other Arab leaders who rejected peace then, imagine if they had embraced 2 states for 2 people rather than declaring war in 1947. We could have had a very different last 75 years. Also had the British not appointed the Grand Mufti. The Grand Mufti, I should have mentioned this before, was actually appointed by the first British High Commissioner of Palestine, so essentially the most powerful British leader in the mandate was, at the time, the first High Commissioner, Herbert Samuel. He was Jewish and a Zionist. He made the grave mistake of appointing Haj Amin al-Husseini as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the most powerful Muslim leader in the land, and the thinking was that since he was an anti-Zionist and a very outspoken anti-Semite, then Herbert Samuel and the British would be seen as a little more trustworthy by the Arab population. And we see how this appeasement, this is just one example of the British efforts to appease Arab terrorism going back to the 1920s, again after the massacre. They could have then decided, okay, he shouldn't be the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, but no, they doubled down. And despite the hundreds of hours of testimony which show that he was responsible for this incitement campaign that led to these riots, the British instead concluded that it was a peaceful Jewish march to the Western Wall on Tisha B'Av that sparked these riots. And the British responded to the massacre by limiting Jewish immigration and Jewish land purchases. Notice I say land purchases because contrary to the disinformation campaign of today, none of this land was being stolen. It was being purchased at exorbitant prices from the Arab landowners who were selling their land and then not using that money to pay the Arab tenant farmers who then lost access to that land. And instead, they turned around after selling that land and then went to their population and said, look, the Jews are stealing your land and stealing your jobs and evicting you from your land. Go get them. And
So are there, as you mentioned these inflection points, is there anything that you think of that you think Israel or before 1948 the Yishuv could have done differently as well to change the course of history?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that Israel, over the course of the last 4 or 5 decades, has missed many opportunities to empower moderate, peace-seeking Palestinians. I think today Israel is making that same mistake. I think that the years of the Benjamin Netanyahu's government, or Benjamin Netanyahu himself, requesting and approving the transfer of millions of dollars to Hamas was one of the gravest errors of judgment of any Israeli leader ever. So I think that's just one example of how that's not even just a case of missed opportunities.
Can you talk a little bit more about why Netanyahu did that, just so that people in the audience here understand and know about that?
Yeah,
and then we'll get
so
back
there
to
was this, it's known as the conception in Israel, that there was this idea that Hamas, despite its charter and its declaration of intent to destroy the state of Israel and to kill Jews, there was this idea that they could be placated if only they have the money to pay their people. So whether it's the government, because Hamas was and technically still is the governing power in Gaza, as long as they have the money to pay their workers, their fighters, and the people of Gaza have enough money and jobs, then we'll have peace. They won't attack us. And so that was kind of the thinking behind not only allowing Qatar to fund Hamas, but also the thinking behind so many of the warnings that went ignored over the years, and especially in the immediate lead up to October 7th, so many warnings were ignored, whether it was from female soldiers who were the spotters on the border telling their higher-ups that they were seeing Hamas training for something massive and their warnings were dismissed. That was all a part of this conception that Hamas didn't want a war, didn't want to have this massive confrontation with Israel because they knew Israel would defeat them swiftly. It was all kind of part of this, these massive errors that led to October 7th.
Yeah, so one of the parts of the book that I really liked and that I really appreciated, talking about failures on both sides, is that I see the journalism part of you coming out at the end of the book. You're interviewing settlers in Hebron and the few Palestinians who would actually speak to you. You interviewed them, and you really see that that there was a recent book that came out from two of the negotiators talking about that this is at heart a clash, a narrative clash. And you really see that at the end of the book nowadays, that you have settlers saying, this is our land, Palestinians saying, this is our land. And, I'm wondering, the challenge, and I say this to people, like, this is just an impossible situation, because you have two peoples who have no ability to acknowledge or accept the claims of the other side. And I'm wondering, at the end of the book, you talk about that we can have hope. In your last paragraph, you talk about hope, even after October 7th. And I'm wondering, with these narrative clashes, how do we have hope? How is it possible for people to move forward?
So it's interesting that you brought that up, because when I was speaking to these people, what I came away with was how similar they were. Because at the end of the day, they weren't saying that only we can live here. Whether they were settlers or Palestinians in Hebron, they were saying, we just want to live here in peace. We just want to be able to exist here. So if it was the settlers, they were saying, we want to be able to live here without Palestinians attacking us and trying to kill us. And if it was the Palestinians, they were saying, we just want to be able to live here while being able to travel to work, visit our families. We want to just be able to live our lives in dignity. And I think that's why I have hope. One of the reasons I have hope is because at the end of the day, so many of these people who are considered enemies, whether by themselves or by observers, they have so much more in common than they have to separate them. And I think that at the end of the day, it's leaders, corrupt leaders, who want us to be enemies and want to stoke those dueling narratives and ensure that there will be many more years of this conflict. I mean, I heard it from Palestinians throughout my years of reporting that the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, none of them want a Palestinian state, because then they'll actually have to do the hard work of governing. It's much easier for them to just be stateless and get billions of dollars in aid from the international community without any expectations of, good governance or building a state. Whereas I think that for most of the history of Israel, we have had leaders who do truly want peace. And I think that in the aftermath of October 7th and with this current government, I think it's very difficult to imagine a much more peaceful future between Israelis and Palestinians. But I do think that there are still, I think the ordinary vast majority of both Israelis and Palestinians truly do just want to live in peace together. And I think that mostly we just hear from the loudest people in the rooms. I mean, wherever we are, we hear from the people who make the most noise, and the people who make the most noise are the extremists. And I think that's true on both sides. I think there are obviously more extremists on one side than the other, and the extremists on one side are carrying out more deadly attacks than the other. And I'm not talking about our side, but I think the people like Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib or Samer Sinjalawi, just some of the most prominent voices for peace and coexistence within Palestinian society. I think those are the people who need to be elevated, whether it's by the international community, by people who want to see peace in this region. those are the people who need to be empowered, and those are the voices that need to be heard if we're going to see a different future beyond just endless cycles of violence.
So can you talk a little bit, you were in the middle of writing this book on October 7th. First of all, did you come back to the United States before October 7th? So you were here already.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about how October 7th changed the trajectory of the book?
Yeah, so before October 7th, the book was still going to be about this massacre in 1929 and how it shattered hopes for coexistence in 1929, how it strengthened the Zionist movement, and really just changed and formed the bedrock of this conflict. But after October 7th, it became much more about the echoes between 1929 and October 7th, what those haunting parallels tell us, because the driving forces of both, the aftermath of both, the widespread denial of the atrocities that took place, the victim blaming, all of that we've gotten so used to since October 7th, that was all also the case after 1929. And I think that what changed most in my perspective in the book was the fact that before October 7th, when I was writing this, I could never imagine for a second, and never did imagine for a second, that anything similar to what happened in 1929 would happen again. And in the few cases where I did imagine, like, what if something like that happened, I really imagined that something like that would be a wake-up call to the world. I thought that learning about this massacre, the fact that this ancient Jewish community in British Mandate Palestine in 1929 was massacred long before there were Israeli soldiers, before there was any such thing as Palestinian oppression or victims. There were no Israeli settlements, no state of Israel. This was 2 decades before the state of Israel was born. I thought that perhaps learning about that would open people's eyes to what this conflict is truly about. And then instead, what we saw was celebrations around the world of October 7th, and even worse, victim blaming than what I had read about in 1929, because the victim blaming in 1929 was only coming from Arab leaders, Arabs in Palestine, the newspapers around the world that covered the massacre. So, it was on the front page of the New York Times for days, on every major newspaper around the world was covering these riots. And in not one case did I read of these massacres being justified. In 1929, newspapers and the journalists they employed were not attempting to explain the context behind why children and men and women were massacred and slaughtered, and why children and women were raped. I mean, there was no effort to contextualize that. It was shown for what it was, a horrific massacre. And the fact that after October 7th, I saw so many, supposedly respectable institutions and news organizations and people that I had once considered friends essentially justifying the massacre of October 7th, it became very clear that along the way, the plot had been lost. And so much of what this conflict is and has always been about is just completely unknown outside of Israel. I think if you talk to most Israelis, they know about the Hebron massacre. They know that this conflict isn't truly about settlements or occupation. They understand that when Palestinians talk about occupation, they're not talking about the military occupation of the West Bank. They're talking about the occupation of the entire Muslim land of Palestine. And what was most shocking to me after October 7th was the fact that I came to understand that through my conversations with Palestinians writing this book, that we're not talking about the same things here. When we talk about peace and we talk about liberation, that's not what is in many of their minds. They're talking about a liberation from Jewish sovereignty. They're talking about a liberation of Al-Aqsa from, any kind of Jewish control or, presence. And so the fact that now that line of thinking and that ideology is also very clearly has taken hold of, academia, the arts, the field of journalism, which I no longer even feel part of because of this, because the way Israel is seen as just in itself an occupation of Palestinian land, which is just ahistorical and, false. Yet making that argument today with people who believe this, it's just impossible to get through them. And so after October 7th, writing this book, I was just always hoping that the people who really need to read it will. I still don't know if that's the case. I hope so. I do think that at the end of the day, we also need more than anyone else to know our own history. And I think that when we're faced with these lies and this propaganda campaign, we more than anyone need to be able to challenge those lies. And if we don't understand our own history or the history of Israel, how can we challenge those lies? How can we correct the disinformation and misinformation if we don't have the facts? And I think the best tool to counter the anti-Semitism we're facing today is through countering that disinformation, because that's what's fueling it at the end of the day.
It feels to me, I just want to say, in the way that I think there's a direct line between Martin Luther and Adolf Hitler, I feel like we need to understand and have the language to say there's a direct line between the Mufti and Hamas. And that's where I feel like your book is really important in making that connections for people. And that's why I say it's not, if you haven't read the book, I really encourage you to. If you don't like to read, it's available on Audible. Yardena is a great writer and she's a great storyteller. So you don't even really realize that you're reading a history book, but you are reading a book that is filled with history, but you're also reading a really compelling and painful but important story. So I want to give a plug for it, and I want to explain that the reason we are not selling books tonight is because it's the second night of Sukkot. Otherwise we would have, but they're available on Amazon, and you should definitely get the book. It's well worth it. Do you have another question?
Do we want to open it up to folks now for questions? Right, we take another, 15 minutes for question and answer? Sure. Yeah. Anybody have any questions?
I'll just check. Could you say more about the British and why did they side?
So he asked if I could speak more about the British and why they ended up siding more with the Arabs than the Jews. So I think it's really interesting, and this was another surprising aspect of my research that I learned while writing this book when you asked what was the most surprising aspect of the massacre. The fact that the British have gotten off so easy. I feel like whenever we talk about this conflict, it's as if the Israelis and the Palestinians are the only actors here, when really this is really a result of British incompetence that this conflict has gone on for so long, and even that it exists in the first place. Because what the British did was that they made two conflicting promises. They promised the Jewish community a home in Palestine, and in the course of fighting against the Ottoman Empire in World War I, they convinced Arabs in Palestine and throughout the Ottoman Empire to rebel against the Ottomans. The Grand Mufti actually was one of those former Turkish soldiers who abandoned his post and then recruited thousands of Arabs in Palestine to fight for the British, to oust the Turks. And to get the Arabs of the Middle East to turn against the Ottoman Empire, they did so by promising them independence. And in some cases, they did reward Arabs in certain areas independence. So, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, various kingdoms were benefited from their support for the British, but the Arabs of Palestine felt betrayed because they thought they were also going to get independence, not an independent Palestine. They weren't actually speaking about a state of Palestine. That only happened decades later. What they wanted was an independent Arab kingdom of which Palestine would be a part. It was going to be the southern part of Syria, and it would be under King Faisal, who was then fighting against the French. So basically the British made many promises to different people, and then in classic British fashion, they just constantly try to please all of the sides. And when you're trying to please all of these dueling sides, nobody is going to be happy. And I think that's an understatement for what ended up happening as a result. But they essentially caved to Arab pressure. Arab terror, not only with the massacre of 1929, but also between 1936 and 1939 with the Great Arab Revolt against British rule and against Zionism. Again, the British thought that if they limit Jewish immigration and land sales, again, even more making those quotas even stricter against the backdrop of Nazi persecution, and even amidst the Holocaust, the British didn't, they didn't relax those quotas. I feel like a lot of people aren't aware that during the Holocaust and even after the Holocaust, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees who tried to flee to the land of Israel, to the shores of Palestine, were either sent back to Europe by the British or detained in British internment camps in Cyprus and in Palestine during the Holocaust and after. So that was also one of the many cases of Arabs trying to appease terror. And in every case, it only strengthened terror and told the people committing those acts of violence that violence works, it pays off, and the British still haven't learned their lesson. Yeah, I'm so happy you brought that up. I feel I did a disservice to all of you by not mentioning that, so I'm so glad you did bring that up, because it's so important to note that while 67 men, women, and children were slaughtered that day on August 24th, 1929, at least 200 Jews were saved by their courageous Muslim friends, neighbors, and landlords who risked their lives by hiding them in their homes or stood guard outside of theirs. And the rest of the Jews who survived did so either by hiding under dead bodies, kind of like on October 7th, or they managed to hide behind furniture in rooms that were undiscovered. And after the massacre, the Jewish community in Hebron, the leaders of the Jewish community, sent these letters of gratitude that were signed by all, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi, the chief Sephardi rabbi, the, various leaders of the Jewish community in Hebron signed these letters. And to this day, the descendants of these Muslim heroes, some of them still have these letters. Sadly, I was only able to meet 2 of them, because today in Palestinian society, the descendants of those heroes are not proud of what their ancestors did. Or perhaps they are proud, but they're afraid to be known as the descendants of Muslims who saved Jews, because they're seen as traitors to their cause. And that actually wasn't the case in 1929. I didn't come across any stories of, Muslims who saved Jews in 1929 being attacked after the fact. But the fact that the Mufti remained the most powerful official, Arab official or Muslim official in Palestine after the massacre, really kind of made him so much more emboldened and led to him beginning this tactic of either having his political rivals assassinated or silencing his critics in the press with harassment or worse. And today, Hamas, you mentioned, is the political heir of the Grand Mufti. One of the many things they learned from the Grand Mufti is this tactic of silencing critics by labeling them all collaborators. And when you're labeled a collaborator, you could be executed in the streets of Gaza or the West Bank, and people will cheer on your execution. And the Grand Mufti started this tactic, and in many ways, he set the formula for every Palestinian leader since, in terms of distracting his people from his own corruption. Hamas has done that in horrific ways.
So we have time for one last question. Sue.
Yeah, that's a yeah. So that's a great question. The testimonies of the victims, thankfully, were collected in the immediate days after the massacre. So there were people in the hospitals in Jerusalem going and speaking to the people who were injured, asking them where they had been when they were attacked. Because the attacks, I think I mentioned, they started in Jerusalem and they ricocheted across the land, but Hebron wasn't the only place that experienced a massacre. There was also a massacre in Sfat, in Moza, outside of Jerusalem. The testimonies that were collected, that was one of my primary sources because they were so extensive. And it was, you could see how various people in Hebron, for example, it was all corroborated. Like they would say the same thing, they had witnessed the same things. And what would happen in one house would happen in the next house. And the testimonies were also from British officials, from reporters. So the British actually instituted a blackout of local press, so there was no Hebrew press allowed for a week in Palestine, and I think that was because they feared a rebellion by Jews against the British for their failure to protect them. And there was thankfully, no blackout on American press. So there were American correspondents, foreign correspondents based in Palestine reporting for, the Herald, the New York Times, JTA. And so those newspaper articles also formed a strong basis for my research. And the Palestine Post, once the British rescinded their censorship orders and the local press was able to report, the reporting was just so descriptive. So they were, the reporters were going into Hebron or into the hospitals where victims were being treated, taking these testimonies, and they were just really vivid. Also, several survivors of the massacre in Hebron wrote books. There were memorial booklets put together by the surviving yeshiva students. So that was how I found out what happened to David when he was killed, because the family didn't know how he had died. There were all these different legends. The family told, one of them said that he was killed in the yeshiva trying to save his rabbi. Another one was that he went to the synagogue to try to rescue the Torah scroll. It is a heroic story, but sadly neither of those stories were true. But yeah, there was a lot to work with, surprisingly.
So I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. Yardena, I want to thank you for writing such a compelling, painful but compelling book. And again, I want to encourage all of you to read the book. I'm sorry that this was the reason that we brought you to our community to help us commemorate October 7th, and yet I'm so grateful that you were here because I think it was a really good message. Thank you all for coming this evening. It concludes our program, and I'll just say Chag Sameach to you all. And I'm actually going to say something to you too.
I mean, yeah, we had Shai talking on your behalf. Right, yeah, I saw you.
Thank you for this.
At
No, but the book puts it together
he
really
was saying too,
And
like,
I don't think that we really clearly
academia has become
the refugee, like I said. And
that's
just
really
like
the problem. You know, which is interesting. The president of Wesleyan is also been talking about Wesleyan, and he's been going around talking about like how academia has really lost its way, and we don't need Trump coming in and doing what he's done in reaction.
Did I take it or did you? Oh, here.
There needs to be.
I think it just doesn't come out of nowhere.
That's what we've seen. That's what we've seen in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Every time they hurt us, we clamp down harder on them, which makes them want to hurt us more.
I know I love it.
Right? It's, yeah.
Did you tell him?
Yeah.
So the British rounded up and arrested
Tell him that.
hundreds of Arabs who they then released, and only 3 men were actually sentenced to anything meaningful other than, a few months in prison. For example, the ringleader of the massacre in Hebron was this Muslim official, the Waqf in Hebron, the head of the mosque, and he only got 3 months in prison, even though so many people testified that he was leading the mob, saying, go into this house, there's beautiful women in here, and go into this house, he's got lots of money in his closet. So only 3 men in the end were sentenced to death, and they were hung by the British. And to this day, they are memorialized as heroes of the Palestinian cause. The date of their death is known as Red Tuesday, when they were executed, and it's one of the most famous Palestinian national poems, Red Tuesday. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a quick question for you. Great talk. Would you be able to come out
I spoke in Philly last year at the Museum of American Jewish History. But I'd be happy to come out to Pennsylvania. Okay, nice.
our rabbi?
I just finished it.
Wow. So you think I could speak? That would be great. Because I've spoken to a lot of synagogues, and as important as I think that is, I think it's important to also reach the non-Jewish community. I would love to. Yeah. Okay.
We read this.
What are you doing up here?
I'm visiting.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay.
Then we wound up in Pennsylvania. I don't
Oh, was it Cuban scale?
What is over? Everything's over. This kid's cute.
Perfect, that sounds great. I don't know if Johnny told you, I am having a hip on October 29th.
Oh my god. Do you need help with anything?
Not hard.
I know, but still, if you need anything.
If I do, I will be happy to ask, but we can talk to the floor.
Which hip?
I'm ready.
You know, my father had his place in September 11th.
I know, I was hoping that they would ask me.
And so that's the only silver lining to come out of that day. And so every year on the anniversary, we have something, we have that little bit of joy to hold on to. So it's a good thing.
I guess she's both having it done.
I'm sure you are. I'm just hanging around. Thank you, Yardena. Thank you. Great job.
It was a great crowd, so thank you.
Yeah, I think you should be pleased.
And, okay, we had to do something on October 7th, just because we're doing it.
So do you get to rest now?
I'm about to go home and relax.
Good. Yeah, you've had a couple of weeks.
It has been.
Maybe if there will be a glass of wine involved
Not tonight, I think I'm too tired for
Okay.
that, but tomorrow.
tomorrow.
And then I'm going to visit my sister on Thursday. She's in Chicago. And then Friday, I'm going out to Kansas City for a friend's
If they have it, then they're afraid of the backlash they'll get by area. So like, for example, when my book came out, I thought that the publication was great. So my entire career worked out.
I think they're on back. You don't have to talk to us, but I make a better cup of coffee.
None of us like I've always been reviewed in all the Jewish publications.
Not, is she driving to the hotel?
You know, that's if you put it out to share the card.
But other than that, no reason.
I wanted to wait and see.
I worked for looking for okay.
No, I already had one.
I need to go get a book. I'm gonna go run and get my pen. So I can sign it.
Where are you staying?
The MGM.
Downtown?
Yeah.
Okay. Hey,
Very nice.
nice night.
Are you driving back home tonight?
No, I'm staying with Rick and Sue.
Oh, nice. That's great.
But apparently I'm driving Yardena to the hotel.
Oh, if you need, I can drive her. Where did you, you mentioned that you're involved with the JCC and Marblehead, is it? This is a random shot in the dark here.
Hey,
Former colleague of my son I used to work with, her name is Brandy Shevatinsky. She spoke there a couple of years ago. At the time, she was working for something. We were both working for the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values.
I don't know her.
Anyway, I remember she was speaking up there. I'm like, oh.
Oh, that's funny.
So when
Yeah.
you mentioned it, I'm like, oh, maybe she
So
had Brandy.
I was involved for several years with the Jewish Book Month.
Oh, nice.
And Yardena
Well, this was
one
the
of
book.
speakers.
Was that right? Okay.
We had 7 that year, and she was the opener.
You know, Amy and I, we try to stay up on what's going on. Listening to podcasts, books that come out, all that stuff. We have so many so much to be published in the last couple of years. And not just obviously October 7th, or Israel or Zion, because we got plenty of that. Because the abundance of publishing, what's been published in the last 2 or 3 years, it's remarkable in the Jewish world. So.
Yeah.
Good time to be alive for that. Hard to keep up with it all.
A very satisfied comment. Let's just hope things calm down.
We needed to.
Okay, great.
We needed to because,
SPINGEL. I will look forward to it.
the sanity of our people, just the intensity of the arguments. But I saw, and the parallels, you probably heard the expression, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes.
No, I haven't heard that.
The rhyming, I mean, the people when in 1929 they were listening to the warnings about what could happen.
I was ready
Like
for it.
that's
Guess
what?
what?
And that this was the most peaceful of communities, and with all those people saying, no, it wasn't peace coming from Gaza, right? Let's be clear. Before that, but
We're very good. Thank you for coming tonight.
certainly on the Israeli side,
I mean,
the lefties
I'm not
and
crazy. Yeah. But
I have a
is a big.
It's a long story, but Mitzvah Asara, which is one of the Moshavim, is
And
right there, the Gaza
you know,
border.
when they asked us in the interview, I did say,
They have a project they started many years ago, 10, 15 years ago, before the withdrawal in 2005. People used to go in and out. I mean, the stores. Israelis were all the time in and out of Gaza. Get their car fixed, go to the beach, get food, restaurant, whatever it was, right? And so these Moshavim that were right there, like, they're friends and people they worked with or even hired, whatever. Okay, disengagement happens. The wall goes up. So the hard fence. And this will start coming in. So Israel put these huge concrete barriers right at the edge of the Moshav facing Gaza. And so the people on the Moshav, and this is one woman was actually one of my relatives, distant. She started a project called Mitzvot LaShalom, Toys to Peace. So the name of the Moshav is the tenants, who were killed, I think, in 1948. And they said, they're going to send us missiles. We're going to paint on the side of the wall that faces Gaza beautiful paintings of peace and rainbows and sun. And beautiful. And we're going to write. They wrote it in Hebrew, they wrote it in Arabic. I have pictures on my phone. And people would go, and I myself participated. You can get a little mosaic, like a little butterfly or a flower, and you could affix it to the wall, offer a prayer, and like an intention. And they say, they're going to throw missiles at us, we're going to send peace. And that was just so beautiful and so Israeli and all great. So at one point, CNN was doing coverage during the war, and they had that wall in the background as if they were in Gaza. And they clipped the part of the wall where it says in Arabic, Salam. Effectively, they say, see, the Gazans want peace. No, that's the Israeli wall. That's the Israelis wanted that.
That's how it works.
And I'm like, oh my
No,
God.
it's unbelievable.
It's
It's sickening.
and that's the people who they Hamas goes in and defends that motion. So you're down in Egypt, right?
Here, there, yeah, they're right next to me.
And you're going to
Yes,
so my friend is real fun, is the rabbi.
yes, yeah.
I haven't talked to him in a long time. He was a year ahead of me. He was a year ahead of me in rabbinical school over the years.
People love him. I think he's a little liberal for me.
He's a good soul.
Rick and Ann,
See you. You doing all right?
I just always stay at 28 Woodside. I just do.
Please.
It's my house.
Oh, you grew up in that?
I did grow up in
That
that
was
house.
her house before Rick's house.
Right, but your brother doesn't live in that house.
Right. I just stay
That's
there.
so funny.
Yeah, I don't know, I just always stay there.
It's like their room, the master bedroom's at your room, and you kick them out when you're there?
Yeah, that's what I do. That's what I do. And when I bring my dog, she sometimes jumps on their bed with them too. Okay, she's used to sleeping in the master bed, so that's where she goes.
You ready?
Yes. They do. Well, good to see you both.
See you. Nice to see you. Always a pleasure.
Happy to see you. Next time longer, and it will involve coffee or a glass of wine. Okay, is that a plan?
I did see you over the holidays just from afar.
Yes.
I was trying to make eye contact.
That was hilarious that I texted Ann
Yeah.
the next morning. I said, if you see Marjorie, please tell her. Not that's Marjorie, but if you see you.
Marjorie Patkin?
Marjorie Patkin.
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
she was Danny's tutor.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, said if you see Margie, tell her I'm sorry I didn't get to say hello and wanted to chat with her. And then the next 20 minutes later, I just saw her in the Big Y. She said same thing.
Right, like I saw you from
You
afar.
gotta love Long Meadow.
Small world.
It is.
All right.
All right,
It's a
good to
small
see
world.
you.
See you guys.
All right, I haven't been to the MGM Hotel, so,
Is that what she's saying?
yes.
She can get some gambling in the
Yeah,
meantime.
right, exactly. I'm sure she'll be down.
I had jury duty back in the spring, and you park at the MGM Hotel, at the casino, all that jazz over
Yeah,
there. 'Cause
yeah.
it's kind of right next to the courthouse.
Right.
So I'd never been there. The fastest way was like to walk through it. What a different world. And like in the middle of the day, you walk into the dark, and the bells and the whistling.
Yeah, yeah.
Quite
But anyway,
something.
your friend. Yes, so go, if they'll, yeah, go with them. Go with them.
Make sure everyone's accounted
Yeah,
for and has
right,
the right
right.
car.
But anyway, your friend is, people love,
Yeah, he's a good soul.
people really,
He's a good guy.
really like him.
Listen, the reform movement, it's not the movement that I grew up in or know, and I'm not the only rabbi who feels this way. It's so upsetting to me, because I'm a reform Jew. I practice and I believe. I work for a reform synagogue, and proudly so. But in terms of the movement and what's going on in terms of some of the ideology, one of those is Zionist embracing. I mean, certainly embraces, that's where I go. But it's not. It's very weak in my estimation.
Yeah.
Sadly disappointing.
That's why I rejoined Bethel.
Yeah.
I come here for Rosh
This is a
Hashanah.
great rabbi.
A great rabbi.
No, but
you know.
I actually think the conservative movement has its head on pretty straight on a lot of matters.
I wonder if I need to rescue her. You think?
Yes. Is that her bag there? Okay.
Okay.
Yardena, I brought your bag from
That's
my
great.
office.
So nice. Really, really nice.
It was really great.
Thank you.
Great to meet you too. Thank you, and good luck with the college search. Applications.